Adam and Hoss Cartwright, two brothers featured on Bonanza, were polar opposites. Two gentle giants, Adam, an intelligent and well-educated architect, and Hoss, a kind and generous soul. Even when filming was taking place, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker remained separate actors. The show's writers and co-stars frequently found themselves in odds with Pernell, who was notorious for his vocal criticism of the program. As for Dan, he sought refuge away from Hollywood since he loved playing Hoss but hated the attention it brought. After Blocker's unexpected death at the age of 43, their paths separated even more sharply. In the midst of the mourning, Roberts made a shocking choice. Unfortunately, he skipped the funeral. What kept him at a distance? Bitterness, sadness, or something more profound? Even though Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker are now well-known Bonanza performers, their lives were filled with unexpected turns and fascinating adventures before they became famous. It's mind-boggling to consider how drastically different their formative years were. Still, they ended themselves working together on one of TV's most memorable series by some twist of fate. Return with me to the beginning. Adam Cartwright's father, Pernell Roberts, had a profound affection for the theater. In 1949, he took the stage at Maryland's Olney Theater for his first major performance. Picture him when he's young and ambitious. Working on The Man Who Came to Dinner with Kitty Carlisle and Moss Hart. Though it was early on, he was clearly demonstrating potential. After that, Pernell continued unabated. Among his many roles were those of Alfred Doolittle in Pygmalion and Dan in Night Must Fall. You could tell this man was destined for greatness since he was gifted and adaptable. When Pernell was ready to go on to greater and better things in 1952, he left for New York City. Right now, he's widely recognized. Pernell did not squander any time getting involved in the New York theater scene in the 1950s, when it was the epicenter of the industry. Performing in Shakespearean plays and one-act operas, he worked off-Broadway. Think of him strutting on the stage as Macbeth or as Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. It was for that act that he received a Drama Desk Award in 1955. Very impressive. Classical roles were his passion during his stay at the American Shakespeare Festival. Although he was not hesitant to explore new avenues. He was a versatile actor who brought his unique style to roles in plays ranging from The Merchant of Venice to Twelfth Night. Like so often, Pernell also received an invitation to appear on Kraft Television Theater, where he made his television debut in 1956. Back in the day, you could have seen him on Whirlybirds or Cheyenne, among other things. Even though he was starting to seem familiar, his true home was on stage. Still managing his time between film, television, and the stage, he signed a contract with Columbia Pictures in 1957. In 1958's Desire Under the Elms, he made his film debut playing the son of Burl Ives. No one could have missed Pernell's talent for embodying complex, multi-layered personalities. Simultaneously, Dan Blocker was paving his own path in an entirely different realm. Dan's rise to fame was more circuitous than Pernell's. He stood tall. His kind spirit was obvious, really. During the Korean War, Dan was inducted into the army before he ever set foot in Hollywood. It must have been challenging for him to serve as an infantry sergeant. This guy saw action and was so courageous that he was awarded a Purple Heart. His subsequent portrayal of Hoss Cartwright as a strong and kind individual must have been influenced by those experiences. Returning to civilian life after the war, Dan began to experiment with acting. Outer Space Jitters, a 1957 Three Stooges short, featured him. Isn't it amusing to picture him in that kind of position? On the other hand, Dan was hilarious and not shy about playing eccentric roles. You could have seen him in Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, or even The Rifleman. In Richard Diamond, Private Detective, he had a notable early part as a rodeo performer. Blacksmiths, bartenders, and cattlemen were just a few of the roles he filled. With time, he became known for his reliable character acting. At the same time, Pernell and Dan were headed straight for an accident. Pernell had established himself as a renowned actor by the late 1950s, performing in a variety of roles across film, television, and Broadway. Conversely, Dan was establishing himself in westerns. He was as at home in the genre as he was with it, and his warmth was what really set him apart. Both men experienced career-defining incidents in 1959 that would eventually bring them together. Playing opposite Randolph Scott as a multi-layered bandit, Pernell made an appearance in the film Ride Lonesome. His portrayal was praised by critics, who ranked it among his finest roles to date. The fact that he could provide nuance to seemingly flat characters was on full display. Concurrently, Dan portrayed a distressed rancher in the pilot episode of The Rebel. His ability to bring humanity to challenging, iconic roles was on full display in this small but significant part. Bonanza followed. Producing a family drama in the Wild West, David Dortort was casting the show. He was looking for performers who could give the Cartwright family their own distinct flavor. Characters with strong personalities that could shine on their own and yet contribute to a team effort. Because of Adam Cartwright's prominence and Pernell's stage presence, the eldest son of the Cartwright family was a perfect match. You would have thought he could hold his own on a vast ranch just by exuding an aura of quiet intensity and command. As Hoss, the kind giant with a golden heart, Dan played the opposite role. Dortort noticed something exceptional in Dan, and it had nothing to do with his height. Dan was the ideal choice for host because he was charming and someone viewers could root for. He seems tailor-made for the part. Suddenly, everything began to fit together. On the brink of television history, two men with radically different backgrounds, Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker, were going to set foot on the Bonanza set. Unbeknownst to them, a sea change was on the horizon for both their lives and their jobs. Bonanza made a big splash upon its 1959 launch. This western wasn't like the others. Gunfights, outlaws, and seedy saloons weren't the only things that happened. The stunning Nevada landscape served as the setting for Bonanza's storylines of morality, family, and doing the right thing. The show revolved around the Cartwright family, who were more than simply ranchers. They represented courage, generosity, and the importance of doing the right thing no matter the cost. Even though Pernell Roberts and Dan Blocker had a rocky run on the program, they became integral parts of that family dynamic. Adam Cartwright was portrayed by Pernell, the firstborn child. Adam stood out from his brothers because he was well-educated, cultured, and creative. He was the family's go-to architect and engineer, and he was always the one to come up with creative solutions. Pernell was spot on as Adam, lending the character an air of gravity. However, Pernell began to feel constrained by the characters and the show's limitations as the series progressed. He was accustomed to playing new and interesting roles in the theater. He felt unfulfilled playing Adam in the same outfit and surroundings week after week. When Pernell got angry, he didn't hold back. He frequently panned the show, calling it junk TV and critiquing its shallow plot. The stories, in his opinion, were overly simplistic and avoided complex social justice and racism themes. He went so far as to say that appearing on Bonanza was like having Isaac Stern sit in with Lawrence Welk. It was that bad for him to be a part of something he thought was beneath him. However, Pernell had issues beyond the scripts. His character, a man in his 30s, constantly needed to ask his father, Ben Cartwright, Lorne Greene, for permission to do things, and he despised that. He criticized the relationship as adolescent and stated that it was illogical for the three grown men to depend on their dad so heavily in interviews. For some reason, he was dissatisfied since he didn't see his role evolving. Meaningful, challenging stories were what he sought. The opportunity to further develop his acting chops. Dan Blocker totally bought into his character as Hoss Cartwright, while Pernell had a hard time following Bonanza's lead. The show's beating heart was Hoss, a large, affable man with a generous spirit. No one else could have played Hoss like Dan, who brought such charisma and humor to the role. It was a perfect fit because the character was based on a boyhood buddy of his who was rough around the edges but soft within. The part was also an opportunity for Dan to share his views. "We shall pass this way on earth, but once, let us do any compassion we can show, right now," that was a quotation he cited when he played Hoss. That generosity was evident in every scenario. Strangers could always count on Hoss to provide them a hand, defend the downtrodden, and reveal the kinder side of the Cartwrights movement. His co-stars and fans alike adored him for it. However, the set was not always without its bumps. Dan and Pernell were in a terrifying accident in 1962 while filming an episode called The Dowry. One of Pernell's horses slipped and fell while they were galloping downhill on a muddy trail. Dan, who was following closely after, too fell victim to the chaos. Even though they attempted to leap to safety, the two men were injured. Dan separated his shoulder and collarbone, and Pernell strained his neck. To accommodate Dan's sling-bound arm, the production had to make some changes to the screenplay. Physical wounds weren't the only thing the accident affected. It appeared to be just another cause for Pernell to want off the show. Having to cope with an injury compounded his already miserable situation. Some even went so far as to say that the accident was his breaking point. He remained on Bonanza for a few more seasons, but by then it was obvious he no longer cared. The interaction amongst the cast members was complex behind the scenes. The producers and authors frequently found themselves at differences with Pernell because of his outspoken temperament. Even when it meant upsetting others, he never shied away from expressing his thoughts. On the other hand, Dan was more sociable and laid back. Everyone loved him on sight because of his charisma and hilarious sense of humor. The two actors were respectful of one another despite their dissimilarities. Even though they weren't exactly best friends, they were a great acting team that made viewers care about the characters they played. Dan discovered new outlets for his pent-up energy as Pernell's dissatisfaction with the show intensified. Among his film credits are Frank Sinatra's Come Blow Your Horn. Additionally assisted in the establishment of the Bonanza Steakhouse restaurant chain. He made commercial appearances and paid personal trips to franchises to promote the business, leveraging his popularity as Hoss. It was a brilliant move that demonstrated his complete commitment to his work on Bonanza. Despite Pernell's reservations, the show never shied away from addressing serious topics. Shows like Enter Thomas Bowers broke new ground in their treatment of racism. An African-American opera singer is in danger of racism in Virginia City, but Hoss steps in to assist her. The episode was moving because it portrayed the Cartwrights fighting for justice. In addition to The Wish and The Fear Merchants, other episodes gradually expanded the Western canon by tackling issues like racism and inequality. Still, Pernell thought there was more the show could have offered. More profound tales with more impactful themes were what he sought. He finally had enough by 1965. He walked away from one of television's most beloved series after fulfilling his 6-year contract. The reason that Adam, his character, had moved away was written out. Pernell never reappeared, but Adam was occasionally mentioned in later episodes. Contrarily, Dan remained with Bonanza until his tragic death in 1972. He was always there, adding his trademark charm and wit to the show. Hoss had a devoted fan base. Dan's depiction of him had a profound effect. Despite their differences, Pernell and Dan were both instrumental in Bonanza's success. Thanks to its inspirational messages as well as its entertaining anecdotes, the program became an icon in popular culture. The Cartwright brothers exemplified the finest qualities that humans are capable of, whether it was Hoss's generous spirit or Adam's wit. Their complicated relationship mirrored the rest of their time together on Bonanza. Even Pernell was taken aback by Dan's death in 1972. Many admirers are still perplexed by the events that unfolded following Dan's passing. I don't understand why Pernell Roberts skipped the burial for Dan Blocker. Tragically, Dan Blocker passed away at the young age of 43 following gallbladder surgery due to a pulmonary embolism. His untimely demise devastated the Bonanza cast and stunned Hollywood. On and off camera, Dan was the show's beating heart. His portrayal of Hoss Cartwright was beloved by viewers for the humor, friendliness, and distinct warmth he offered to the role. Dan avoided the limelight and was renowned for being an ordinary guy when he wasn't on film. He wasn't suited for fame. Acting was his passion, but he despised the limelight it inevitably brought. He went to extreme lengths to get away from it, even relocating his family to Switzerland in 1970, where he had fallen in love with the picturesque Lake Nation while on vacation. Dan's decision to relocate to Switzerland revealed much about his character. He wished his loved ones a peaceful existence outside of Hollywood's hectic pace. His career had been very easy in comparison to other performers, and he had expressed shame about it at one point. Dan maintained his modesty despite his achievements. All that glitter and glamour didn't bother him. His loved ones and the principles he held dear were important to him. Those who knew him found his death all the more tragic because of his modesty. The death of a brilliant performer wasn't the only tragedy. The death of an honest human being was the result. Members of the Bonanza staff and cast were shocked and saddened to hear about Dan's passing. Little Joe's actor Michael Landon was particularly rattled. In retrospect, he admitted that thinking about Dan's death would bring him to tears whenever he needed to cry during a scene. In an unprecedented move, the show's producers decided to address Hoss's absence. Recognizing his passing was a first in television history, they chose not to replace the part or kill him off quietly. Although the narrative did not provide any specifics, it was evident that Hoss had departed. as the Cartwright's sorrow was palpable. A daring maneuver that highlighted Dan's significance to the show. Surprisingly, Pernell Roberts did not show up at Dan's funeral. His absence has been the subject of conjecture for a long time. Some point to Pernell's tangled history with Bonanza as the reason. In 1965, he departed from the program due to his dissatisfaction with its superficiality and lack of creativity. Deciding to leave the show wasn't a picnic. However, Pernell adamantly maintained that he had to proceed. Although he maintained cordial contacts with a few members of the group after his departure, he generally felt estranged from the rest. People are also wondering about Pernell's whereabouts because of his character. Similar to Dan, he was a very reclusive man. Being in the spotlight was something he tried to avoid, and he also avoided showing his emotions in public. He may have felt overwhelmed by the amount of media coverage that Dan's funeral received. He might have thought it was more dignified to mourn alone, away from prying eyes. Similarly, Pernell's connection with loss was complex. He had a reputation for being deeply contemplative, even depressed, at moments. In an odd attempt to come to terms with the fact that he had outlived all of his Bonanza co-stars, he once called himself Pernell the Last One Roberts. He had a gloomy sense of humor about it. However, it did show that the man in question had dealt with the tragedy in his own unique manner. Much later on, Pernell had nothing but praise for Dan Blocker. His character was that of an amiable, generous individual who was hard to dislike, according to him. Even though they weren't really friendly, Pernell obviously held Dan in high esteem and appreciated their collaboration. It was perhaps Pernell's personal difficulties in saying goodbye that prevented him from attending the funeral, not a lack of concern on his part. The funeral for Dan was the source of the rumors. Among other strange claims, such as the idea that his enormous stature necessitated his interment in a piano box. Even though it's not genuine, the story shows how out of this world Dan appeared to his fans. Actually, he and his parents and sister were laid to rest at a modest family plot in Texas. For a man who had always liked to keep a low profile, it was a respectful and solemn farewell. The end came for Bonanza with Dan Blocker's departure. Without him, the show floundered and ultimately had its lowest-rated 14th and final season. Both the actors and fans missed Hoss. Afterwards, Michael Landon compared losing Dan to losing the show's essence. His absence made it all different. Following his success in Trapper John, Maryland, which aired in the late 1970s, Pernell Roberts went on to star in other successful productions. Bonanza was an integral aspect of his legacy, though, even as he began a new phase of his career. The show may have been problematic for him. Although he was unable to evade its influence or the connection he had with his co-stars, particularly Dan Blocker. Decades after their performances at the Ponderosa Ranch were unforgettable, we can still feel the enchantment they delivered. Remembering the happiness they brought us and the things they left behind can be the greatest way to pay tribute to them.